So thank you. I just wanted to thank Annette, raise my hands to you for sharing your story. That was really, it was moving and frustrating. Yeah, and it made me feel like I live in a different world from the one that you live in, which I say you should come to my world sometime. Yeah, so I wanted to start by acknowledging with respect the territories of the Treaty 7 peoples, and that would include First Nations as well as Métis people. It's important to acknowledge our location on these territories, as we are by and large uninvited guests, and I myself live, work, and play on the unceded territory of Lekwungen and Tsimshian speaking peoples, that is on Vancouver Island. And where I live and work are the lands of the Songhees and the Wasanich and the Esquimalt peoples. And so I've been a very grateful visitor there for 10 years, and I attempt to always ensure that I'm not disrespectful of those people. And so if there are any folks here that this is your traditional territory, thank you for allowing me to be here today. So I'm originally from Nova Scotia. I have Mi'kmaq and French-Acadian ancestry. This is 6 generations of my family. Top center is my daughter and I. I married into an African Caribbean family about 40 years ago. That family settled in Nova Scotia in the 1800s, and so I've learned a lot and am very grateful to be part of that family as well. It's important as well to locate ourselves in terms of the perspective that we bring to any topic that we're talking about, and so I want to acknowledge my own ancestors as well as the ancestors of my daughter. So I was asked to talk to you today about patient-oriented research within Indigenous communities and from an Indigenous perspective. And so I'm going to draw on a couple of examples from the work that I do for, in service of, Indigenous individuals and communities and collectives and nations. And all of those folks at one time or another would probably define themselves as patients of the healthcare system. But in particular, I've been invited to participate and often be the scribe of research that involves Indigenous women living with HIV, and so I'll draw on that experience as well. So just to clarify, the overarching goals of all of the research that we, and I say we because I am never alone in this and I am never the lead in this research, I am working in service to these folks, but the first goal is really to create safe spaces and opportunities for Indigenous folks to tell their own stories of what it is to be a quote-unquote patient, and that can be much broader than their access of health services, right? And so we also want to make sure that we balance our approach, not to make it overly deficit-focused, always telling the sort of traumatized or stigmatizing story of Indigenous people's health and wellness, but to take a strength-based approach and always to be making our meaning of the products of our research relevant to those communities, right? So our audience is always first and foremost the people who are leading and guiding us in the research, and then more broadly Indigenous peoples who will find the products of the research meaningful. And then first and foremost, I think that we really need to, and we've been aspiring to do this for a long time, but making the research environment and our relationships with folks as positively impactful and immediately impactful as we can. And that means making it easy, making sure people are, we're meeting them where they are, making our research relationships as accessible and as community-led as possible, so that people come away from their experiences in research with those of us who are serving them feeling positive, and sometimes, in some cases, healed. So I've had folks say, this research project was healing for me. If any of you were at the SPORE Summit back in, whenever that was, in Ottawa, I co-presented with one of my mentors in the HIV world, Doris Pelletier, and that project, Visioning Health, involves the leadership of Indigenous women living with HIV in terms of a women's council that basically gives us direction in every aspect of the research that we do. And those women have said that being involved in that project has been healing for them in many ways. Not of their HIV, but life is about more than living with a chronic illness. So the other guiding principle that those of us engaged in Indigenous research broadly is to do no harm, right? And so this quote says it all, really, and that is that it isn't just about the research that we're doing, the questions that we're asking, but it is about the way in which we engage, the relationships that we forge, that we nurture, and that we sustain over long periods of time, the engagement we have as human beings and as servants of those folks who need our help in gathering this knowledge. That's most critical, and that research can actually do harm. And so one of the things that I like to talk to people about, and for those of you who are super knowledgeable about Indigenous contexts, this will be a repeat for you, but those who haven't been exposed to this information as much, I like to preface what I'm saying by saying that the context within which we do this kind of research is really critical to think about, right? So that includes the historical context, the social context, and the cultural context. There are others, but for the sake of today's talk, I thought I'll just talk about these three. And this picture basically says it all, and that is that research has been done on Indigenous peoples, for the most part, stigmatizing research for as long as we've had relationships with European people. And so European settlers became very interested in Indigenous peoples from the very beginning of colonization and contact. And so in their attempts to engage, well, not really engage, to research Indigenous peoples, the assumption was that Western knowledge was bringing something to Indigenous folks. And so in the same way that folks who colonized the country believed in terra nullius, that is land belonging to no one, they also, researchers came with the notion that there was no knowledge within Indigenous cultures, that Indigenous cultures had nothing to contribute to the pursuit of knowledge. And so you can imagine, particularly within a pretty racist, well, not pretty, very racist ideology of these folks, that research around brain size and governance structures and parenting became very stigmatizing, to the extent now that what we know about Indigenous peoples is pretty negative. And I don't think folks could argue with that. And sometimes this research harmed people. You're probably all familiar with the government-sanctioned experiments on children in residential prisons. Whoops, schools. Forgot. They weren't prisons, right? Except they were. Yeah, that withheld nutrition from children to explore the impact of that. And so the history's been pretty dark, but the current context isn't much different, right? And so in our communities are still facing structural inequalities and inequities. And so again, most folks have an ideology about Indigenous people that is quite stigmatizing, There's an assumption that folks are unhealthy, that the reasons they're unhealthy belong to the individual or to the racialized group that they belong to, and they're often marginalized in mainstream research. So because I'm an Indigenous person and I have made it my life's work to work in service to community, that means that all I do is Indigenous research. But for lots of folks in the mainstream, they don't see the value of what they do for Indigenous people, or they don't see the value of including Indigenous people. So I'm really happy that you mentioned that earlier, Annette. And so we also know that in research, there is still a predominance of what we would call Western knowledge systems. So there's this what we call epistemic, that is, the ways in which we know something is still very much dominated by Western, by and large, biomedical knowledge, that knowledge is valued and that knowledge is perpetuated within the research that we do. And because we still live in a racist society, and Indigenous people, primarily First Nations people, live within the context of racist legislation, that is the Indian Act, which is a racist document, folks are not willing often to engage in research. And so there's fear and distrust between groups, so Indigenous peoples and settlers, right? And so because of that, people are often not willing to get into relationships. And because research relationships tend to be short-term for most people, there really doesn't seem to be a valuing of establishing those research relationships because they are complex, they involve things that happened before we were all born, and things that we're still, living in terms of the social milieu. And so the other thing that I think is important to remember, particularly when we're talking about this thing called patient-oriented research, is that concepts of self are somewhat different, and I'm using blunt, sort of differences here, and they certainly don't apply to everybody, but within Western knowledge systems and ideologies, the self is more prominent, and the self is more isolated than the contexts or environments within which the self exists. And the self is prominent in things like research ethics. So it's all about the individual, consent, knowledge, engagement. In an Indigenous context, the self is embedded in the context within which folks live. And so the notion of individuality is less prominent, and the context within which folks are living, or the community, whether that's a collective, and I know there are other more recent settlers who bring those kinds of collective ideologies to their lives here in this country. And so that's not to say that those folks don't have that kind of collective sense of self, but it is distinct from a more Western sort of ideology of self, and important to remember. And so the other thing that I like to foreground in these talks is this notion of worldview. And so ontology is just a fancy academic word for saying, what is our sense of reality? Like, how do we know what is real, right? And so within Indigenous worldviews, there is a holistic relationality to our existence. That means that we are more than our physical illnesses or experiences, that we are emotional and spiritual and mental and social and relational, and all of those things are interconnected in ways that you can't just distill out of each other. More recently, Western research has named this as intersectionality, or ecological frameworks. And so there's new language within Indigenous or non-Indigenous paradigms to kind of understand that. But Indigenous worldviews have been this way since time immemorial. There's also this notion of a temporal connection. So that is that we don't live today. Our existence isn't just now, that we are actually living on a temporal plane, that is, where we exist as part of our ancestral knowledge, our ancestors' experience, that we actually live those experiences now, and that our experiences are going to shape the experiences of future generations. And so recently, Western science has started to use words like life stage or intergenerational traumas or histories to understand that temporal context that Indigenous folks have understood for a very long time. And Indigenous worldviews are place-based. That is land, water, right? Those are the fundamentals of an Indigenous worldview, which is very diverse among Indigenous peoples, right? And so people have started to talk about context, that you can't understand something outside of the context within which it is experienced, right? And so that's evolving as well. In terms of epistemology, again, another fancy word for just saying, how do we know something? How do we know that something is the truth or a reality, right? And so, and that notion of truth is also contested within those two different worldviews. The first one is that we all know in many ways, right? So we can learn or we can know something that is not necessarily sitting in our heads. We can know it in our hearts. We can know it in our bodies. We can know it spiritually, and we can know someone relationally, that we can't really just isolate in our brains that we have knowledge, right? And so that term, the term pluralism really helps us to understand that, right? That you can turn 360 degrees around something, and people are often situated that way, and they're all experiencing something in a very different way. And all of those things have value, right? And then the notion that we are all learners and we are all teachers across lifespan, across experience. And so participatory, reciprocal research or learning or capacity development is a given. That is, researchers don't know, and patients or participants don't, not know, right? So no one holds all the knowledge or the only valuable knowledge, right? That we all have something very valuable to learn. So that was that quote that you said from that researcher was really interesting in that regard. And so one of the things that we also have been told by our community leaders is that enough already with the deficit-focused research. We know about the burden of health. We know about the traumatic experiences. We don't need to know more unless the community says, but we don't know about this. But the message that I've received from the women, particularly the women living with HIV, that I've heard is, we have told that story. Now we want to tell a story about our strength, about our wellness in the context of living with this illness. And so a strength-focused research takes us to what is working well. What are the capacities? How are people engaging in ways of wellness that we might not think are relevant, but are very relevant to them, right? Connection being one of them. And I think Annette spoke to that a lot. I mean, that theme of connection, of her connection to others, was very strong in her talk, in her story. And I felt like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it felt to me like that was a really important part of healing. And so we can ask really simple questions. So rather than saying, how come, people aren't doing this, where's the deficit? We can say, how do we support people? What's working really well? And there are tons of wonderful stories. And again, I have been humbled and honored to learn those stories from the research partners that have asked me to engage with them. And I've been honored to share their stories with them. So when we talk about culturally relevant patient-oriented research, what we tend to focus on first and foremost is this relevant to community or collective or group or organization? Is this, we do not focus on something of interest to academics. Like, oh, I wonder about this because nobody cares except me, right? So that's why community-led research is critical to our process, which is that communities, patients, folks who have this lived experience can tell us what we need to be exploring with them, right? And in the case of Indigenous folks, and I'm sure others as well, it's as important to understand the conditions in which, or that are perpetuating, or that are influencing, or that are potentially can address these health issues are equally important to understand, because they often are a part of the story of mitigating or at least improving wellness and healing, right? And making sure that, that again, the solutions are as relevant and appropriate to that context as the questions themselves, right? And so, you know, without, you know, belaboring, residential schools were an intervention meant to help Indigenous peoples. Now that's an extreme example, but I'm pretty sure Indigenous folks didn't have a say in that solution, right? And so people can come up with all kinds of ideas, but without the appropriate cultural and contextual lens, they will not understand the impact or relevance of that solution. Without people, more than one, sitting at the table, guiding, directing, and we're just the monopoly banker, and sometimes we're not even the banker, that's not going to work, right? And we've seen that again and again and again for decades. And then I'm going to talk a little bit later in the afternoon. They've asked me to do a workshop on cultural safety, but one of the things that we haven't talked about in research much is, you know, how cultural safety plays into the work we do. And we've talked about it a lot in terms of healthcare services and the environments in which patients access care or attempt to access care, but we haven't really talked about how that plays out in research environments, and it totally does, right? So we have to make sure that what we're doing is actually culturally safe, but also that the solutions are going to be culturally safe and appropriate. And so, how am I doing? Oh, you don't know? Oh, okay. Oh, great. Yeah, because I'm almost done, right? And so this is going to come as no surprise, based on what I was saying about the concepts of self, which is to say that the individual is not the quote-unquote unit of analysis in the work that we do. Individuals are part of families, whether by birth or choice or partnership. Those families are part of communities. Those communities are part of nations in our case. And if we don't involve and understand those contexts and involve those people, caregivers being one of them, but also people who are cared for by folks living with chronic illness. And so I can tell you that many of the folks that I've worked with are sandwiched between caring for their aging parents and grandparents and aunties and so forth, but also their children and their grandchildren. And in many cases, no one is caring for them. Or if they are, they're playing multiple roles, and they are care provider as well as care recipient, right? And so it's not as simple as saying this person is this one thing, because they're embedded in so many different relationships. And so we have to value those relationships, but we also have to value the relationships that we have. These are people's lives that we're entering into for the purpose of this, like, inquiry. And so this is invasive stuff if not done correctly, right? So we have to make sure that we invest the time and the money into those relationships, building those relationships. And sometimes that means we're not jumping to the gun of, okay, let's get to it, let's get to the question. Sometimes it means we get a Catalyst grant, or we get planning and dissemination grant, where we can actually meet with and build those relationships once they've been requested of us. And it means a longer timeline. I've been working in HIV for 20 years, and I will work in that area so long as the folks that have engaged me ask me to participate, right? And so that's a lifelong commitment. And so it's not for everyone, but this is just my story, right? And so it's what it is, right? And so one of the other things, and I think you mentioned it as well, Annette, is that we also try to look for ways to allocate funds directly to community, right? And that doesn't mean that we decide there's going to be a community liaison, or we're going to pay this, or we're going to do that. That begins at the beginning when the community partners, leaders, tell us what funds need to be allocated to whom in the community. And it always involves our elders, our old ones. Not all of our elders like to be referred to as elders. It is a kind of a church term, and so some people have taken exception and said, you know, we're in our language, at least in the Lekwungen, Sinchothan, and Halkominum language, there is no word that means elder. It just means old one, and old one implies respected person with wisdom that need to be at the table to help us, those of us who haven't lived long enough and understood the world in the same way that they do. We need their guidance. We need their love. We need their compassion. And so we always have those people, and we make sure those people are paid as much as an academic is paid. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Wouldn't that be great? Yeah, because we're really overpaid. Way overpaid. Not that I give back the money, but we're really overpaid. And so the next three are really about the specifics of, and again, this isn't a struggle when community leads, but the specifics of acknowledging and honoring the knowledge that communities and cultures bring. Because I can tell you now, there is so much, no offense, Western knowledge is complicated and sophisticated and wonderful in many respects. But if we can take this two-eyed seeing approach, which I'll talk about this afternoon, to honoring an Indigenous worldview as well as a Western view, those knowledge systems can come together that really make a difference. So honoring those Indigenous knowledge systems, honoring diverse laws around ownership, not necessarily ever having academics own research products. I know, it's tough, but you could do it. I'm a full professor with tenure, and that's all I've ever done. So for those budding academics who are like, I can't do that, you can. You just have to work in the right place and have a nice dean. And so the other thing around that ownership is that you have to acknowledge what cannot be shared. And the folks who tell you that are community partners. So, you know, it's like your life story. If you share your life story with me, I don't own that. I can't do whatever I want with that. That's not ethical, right? So why, you know, should a professional learner like me, that's what I like to call myself instead of a researcher, why should I have a different rights to someone's story? I don't. That person has the right to their story. Yep, I'm just about done. So the other thing that I have loved about working with community is the kind of analysis and knowledge transfer and engagement that we've been able to do. So this is an elder and I working together on an arts-based project. On the other side, that's those Instapic things. I don't have a cell phone, so I don't know what that's called. But that's a young, one of my young grad students that also is doing videography and arts-based research and analysis through arts. And in the middle is also a photo voice project that women did, and they built a lodge to display their photos and to tell their stories. At the bottom, in the middle is the governing council of the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network. I work in in partnership and in service of that community. And you can see our 2 elders are foregrounded. We try to create gender balance with our elders as well. And then we do some standard stuff, right? So that's being a student that, that's doing a poster. But again, it is community that decides how meaning is made and what things mean. And they're totally engaged and actually leading the analysis and the development of the kinds of knowledge products or the ways in which we share the knowledge, first and foremost with the communities that we work with. So I just want to leave you with these couple of questions, and that is, in this era of reconciliation, I like to try to think about how do we incorporate this notion of reconciliation into the kind of work we do, right? How are we trying to promote good relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in the research that we do around this notion that we're calling patient-oriented research? How do we balance those relationships and the processes of that research so that there is equity? And equity means fairness. It doesn't mean equality. It means we go the extra step to make sure that people are being treated justly, like we would want our family treated. I'm going to leave you with this quote by Senator Sinclair, that we're basically all on this road, and those of us that are engaging in this kind of research recognize that we're not going to make change anytime soon, that this is a slow process, but it is one that's worthwhile because it's going to bring a different kind of relationship to our children and our grandchildren and their children for generations to come. So thanks a lot.